up on this week's show, Mode 7-like graphics on the NES.
An amazing new game for fans of Ultima.
And we get the rise and fall of Netscape with Tara Hernandez.
And the Retro Hour podcast is brought to you every week with our amazing friends at Bitmap Books. Now, the book that everyone's going wild for at the moment just landed last week, A Tale of Two Halves, the history of football video games. Now, if you're a fan of footy games, this goes way back to the earliest days of the genre, covering more than 400 classic games. And of course, all the big ones are in there. Sensible Soccer, Kickoff 1 and 2, Match Day, FIFA, of course, Championship Manager, Premier Manager, and it takes us right through from the 1980s to the modern day across 628 pages and interviewing some of the biggest names in the industry. So if you want to check out more about that and, of course, the rest of their retro gaming collection, have a look at their website, bitmapbooks.com. And with our friends at PCBWay. Now, you might have heard about PCBWay before. If you're working on anything over the next few months, they offer fully featured custom PCB prototyping, low-cost, fast turnaround quality boards, and they offer services like 3D printing and injection molding. And of course, you know they're massive supporters of the retro community. Have a look at the Retro Shed project section of their website, and also get an instant quote for yours right now at PCBWay.com. Hello and welcome to the Retro Hour podcast, episode number 452, your weekly dose of retro gaming and technology news with me, Dan Wood.
Me, Ravi Abbott.
And me, Joe Fox.
And very nice to be joining us for the podcast. It comes out every single Friday and just completely nerds out about all things retro, classic video games, and of course, brings you up to speed on what's been happening in the world of retro from over the last 7 days, and welcomes veterans of the industry onto the podcast for a bit of a chat in the second half of the show each week. Now, I did mention that we cover video games there, but actually there is a bit more to our interest in retro than just games, isn't there? Because, you know, even though we describe this podcast as a retro gaming show, we do like to occasionally dabble in retro technology from time to time.
Yeah, I remember we had the Father of Internet Radio one as well, and that was really interesting. And,
Carl Malamud, yeah.
Yeah, without that format, we wouldn't kind of be here today. I loved Eva Pasco as well, talking about early internet cafes and the cyber experience. But one thing that was really important was the first kind of browser that I used to get online. What was yours, Dan?
Yeah, well, mine was... coincidentally, I mean that we have got Tara Hernandez on the podcast this week, who actually worked at Netscape. Now, she was the manager of Netscape Navigator development at the company, Netscape Communications Corporation, and then went on to work on the original Mozilla code for public release. And that was the first browser that I used, because I remember just before I went from secondary school to college, my last year of school, we got, I think it was about 4 machines that we had in the library that were connected to the internet, and you'd have to basically go up to the counter at the librarian and reserve an hour on the internet, and then she'd get a little book out and she'd write down, okay, so you're in there today, after school, you're in there 3:30 till 4:30. You get a little access card, you go over, sit down at the machine, launch up Netscape Navigator, and you get an hour browsing the World Wide Web. Oh my God, that just felt so exciting.
It was the first kind of look into the internet for me as well. And this was all before Internet Explorer dominated the world. And my parents' friend was like a professor, and he had an internet computer upstairs, and I would go up.
Dedicated internet computer.
Yeah, I would go up there and he'd be like, "This is the internet," and then put me on Netscape Navigator, and I'd be like Coca-Cola.com and just searching around on Lycos and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Absolutely loved it, and the story of Netscape's absolutely amazing because they were trying to do loads of innovative stuff with the company, and it was really tough as well because the browser wars were probably as big as the console wars as well.
And a really interesting company as well. I mean, obviously Netscape was founded by Jim Clark, he also founded Silicon Graphics before that, and Mark Andreessen. He worked on the original browser back in the day, Mosaic, which actually obviously later on Mozilla came along, which stood for Mosaic Killer. So it all kind of ties together. And Netscape was really the first insight into the World Wide Web for the general public, I'd say, because originally it was a commercial product, wasn't it? You had to pay for a web browser.
You had to pay for a web browser. Who would have done that? But we all did. And, then, of course, they had the Microsoft court case as well, which was huge at the time, absolutely huge. And we cover that in the interview. But then we talk about, the documentaries as well that Tara was on. Code Rush was
I love that.
Absolutely amazing one. Tell the listeners about Code Rush.
Yeah, if you haven't seen this, it's a documentary that was filmed in 1998. And obviously by then, I mean, like you said, there was the big competition with Microsoft, who released Internet Explorer in 1995. And then, like you said, that became known as the browser wars, because basically Netscape were charging for a commercial product. Microsoft came along and basically shoved it inside Windows 95.
And it was monopoly laws, wasn't it?
Yeah. So who on earth was going to buy Netscape when, you could basically download IE get IE for free with your computer. And then, a group of documentary makers came along and basically filmed what was happening behind the scenes at Netscape during a really interesting time. You think like 1998, when it starts, they're still, kind of dealing with the back and forth with Microsoft, who actually were playing like, office pranks on each other, like leaving like a giant Internet Explorer E's on the lawn outside Netscape's offices. And there was a bit of back and forth with that. But then, this documentary, which you can watch on YouTube, it is free on there. They captured it when they decided to go open source and start the Mozilla project, which obviously became Firefox later on. And also when, out of the blue, AOL bought the company, which, as you can imagine, I mean, AOL kind of back in the day, they were kind of known as like, what your grandma had used to get on the web. So as you can imagine, for all these like, hardcore computer nerds that were working at Netscape, they put a bit of a brave face on things. But watching that documentary and also talking to Tara, who is a big part of the documentary, you can hear a bit more about kind of what was really going on behind the scenes. And you might have watched there's a great kind of docudrama that was on in recent years called Valley of the Boom.
Oh, yes. I love that one. Yeah.
Yeah, which kind of, explores the dot-com boom. Big part of that is Netscape as well. Tara actually gets played by an actress in that, but also she appears as herself as like a...
And there's also a lot of talk of, gaming in this as well. We talk about the games that they play in their downtime. They were going to be working on a huge network with Nintendo at one point, for online gaming. That didn't happen. So, yeah, there's a really interesting mix in this interview, and I think you guys are going to really enjoy this one.
Yeah, so it's great to get a story about a company that obviously we all remember, and probably one of the biggest rise and falls in computing history. Came along, they did like a public IPO, the biggest IPO ever, and then 5 years later, Microsoft had basically crushed them. So
I still run a Netscape theme on my browser at the moment and have that little N in the corner. And I'm like, yeah. Do
you remember watching that N and the little comet would fly over when you were waiting for pages?
And you knew that the internet was working then.
Yeah, awesome. So you got any memories of Netscape? You're going to enjoy this one. You're loving it, Joe.
It was like the longest intro, 10 minutes, because we just nerded out.
We'll get onto your video games in a minute, Joe, don't worry.
Please.
So our special guest, Tara Hernandez, coming on the podcast in around half an hour from now. But of course, we do cover video games too, which is why Joe's here to talk about this. Because let's go through the stories that have been making the headlines over the last week. And this one is a very impressive demo on the NES. Now, this has been dropping a few jaws in the gaming industry this week, that someone's basically got Mode 7 style graphics running on the NES. Now, obviously, Mode 7 was that really impressive effect that we saw in games like F-Zero and Super Mario Kart that allowed the Super Nintendo to rotate and scale backgrounds. Mm. So tell us how they've got this working on the NES, or what this even is.
So this is actually a game called Former Dawn that launched on Kickstarter last week, which is going to be obviously an 8-bit action RPG. And I love what they've put here, an epic 8-bit action RPG with 16-bit soul. Now, if you go check this game out and have a look at it, it looks absolutely beautiful for an NES game. Definitely looks like it could have been on the Super Nintendo. Graphically alone, the music, everything about it. very in the vein of kind of Final Fantasy VI, maybe a little bit Story of 4 from the Mega Drive it reminded me of. It just looks absolutely stunning. And I really do hope that it smashes its goal of £120,000. Now, the reason we're talking about this isn't just, the fact that it's on Kickstarter, but the fact that they're boasting that they have got Mode 7 working on here. Now, if you read into it, it isn't Mode 7, it is a Mode 7 style. So there is a world map akin to classic RPGs for the Super Nintendo, Final Fantasy, Secret of Mana, etc. And it looks like later on in the game, you can fly around the world map, maybe some hover boots by the looks of things. And they demonstrate in this video, the developers of the game, this part of the game running on an original, on real NES hardware to show, the capabilities of this game. And it looks like Mode 7, it looks like F-Zero, etc. But how they've done it is it's actually trickery of kind of like, they've done like Horizon style graphics, which has got like parallax scrolling, and they explain that with the horizon line, it gives like a forced perspective of depth. Yeah. So then you've got the parallax scrolling, the forced perspective of depth, and then scaling all running at once. So it looks like Mode 7, but you can only go up and down and left and right. Whereas in Mode 7, you could rotate the screen as well, like 360. Whereas it doesn't look as though you can on this, but it does say that's not out of the realms of reality. With a little bit more work, they think they can get that running as well. But I think it does look absolutely fantastic. Mode 7 or not, I think it's stunning what they've done with it. Now, it does say, and I don't really understand this part, but it does say that they have had to use some mapping techniques. I'm not too sure.
Yeah, I can talk a bit more about that if you like. So basically what they've done is they're going to be releasing this on a cartridge.
Yeah, of course.
And they've made their own custom memory mapper, which is called the MXM1, which, according to the Kickstarter campaign, said that's the most significant innovation in NES cartridge hardware since Nintendo's MMC5 controller that came out in 1989. So basically the games of the era, the commercial NES games that came out, their ROM sizes were capped at, I think, around 2 megabytes. That's kind of the biggest size that they could support. However, with their MXM1, it allows direct access to many times more. They're basically set up to CD-ROM quantities of data. So you're talking hundreds of megabytes of data it can access. But also, we touched on this last week, that the NES can have audio expansion. We talked about that add-on last week that can offer that. But basically, they're going to be this MXM1 that they've developed has got an audio subsystem as well that actually said is something a bit like a mixture of the Super Nintendo's DSP chip and the Amiga's Paula chip. And they're going to be providing one of these with every copy of the game. So it's basically going to have, really souped-up audio as well. So in terms of technical achievements, this is a bit of a marvel.
Yeah. I mean, I knew there was some crazy magic wizardry going on with it because of, honestly, just go look it up. It's probably the best NES game I've ever seen. I obviously know it's, almost 40 years after the development of the NES now, but it looks absolutely fantastic.
What do you think about this, Ravi?
Yeah, I think it looks really good. It's kind of like you'd show someone and you go, yeah, this is a NES game, and they go, no. that's not the case. I'm wondering, it's not using a special cartridge either. It's just the memory management, right?
Yeah, which is on board on this cartridge. So yeah, it's basically it comes as a package. So they're releasing these on physical. But yeah, I think you're right there, because I think this will be one of those things that you'll see at gaming conventions, and it will be people will run these on their stand to attract attention when people are walking past.
Yeah, and the concept of the game looks good. It's not just a kind of technical achievement as well. It's got that turn-based combat that people really love, and hopefully it'll have a good storyline as well. And some games come out and they're like, wow, they're technically great, but they're rubbish games. But it looks like they've got heart and soul that's going into this.
Yeah, I mean, at the time of recording, they're already hitting around, like $20,000 a day, weren't they? The Kickstarter. So, I mean, it probably is back by the time this episode comes out. But you have got a bit of time left on it. November 14th, the campaign ends. So if you want to get involved in that, I will link that up in this week's show notes. Now, speaking of new games with a retro style, this is actually a Steam game But if you're a fan of like, the old role-playing games like Ultima and a lot of those old dungeon crawlers, this one looks incredible. This is a game called Cyclopean.
Yeah, this looks really interesting. I used to play dungeon crawlers, but I never played like Ultima. We're not This Week in Retro. They're always talking about Ultima.
They're the guys for that kind of thing. Yeah.
I'm sure they would absolutely love this. I love this due to the style and also, the speed of it. Obviously, you're running on a faster platform as well with faster processing. The dungeon crawlers I played were very slow. Going around. Hired Guns was one that you loved as well, wasn't it? That was
DMA Design. That was an awesome game. There was actually one. I think it was Ultima 6. I had a rolling demo on the Amiga back in the day, like the intro on that.
Yeah.
A long time since I've seen it. But obviously we did a full episode with Lord British, didn't we, in the early days of the podcast, exploring the history of Ultima. And obviously, if you're a fan of RPG games, that is kind of up there in the absolute classics.
Yeah, I definitely need to play it, I'll ask Neil RMC to give me some tips on that one. But this game looks really well stylized. It's interesting because it's got like switchable color palettes. There's already pre-built scan lines in there. And I'm thinking some of the videos of it are not the ideal representation of it because there's a little bit of digital artifacting.
I was looking at that. Do you not think that's I thought that was like a scan line effect?
No, I think that's the way they've captured it or the way that it's being played through a digital processor. Because I can imagine playing this on a big monitor and seeing it, it's going to look totally different because it does get a little bit messy. And you've kind of got like, you remember EHB, half bright mode, the kind of, I'm not sure it's all made up of dots and it looks interesting. I do like the colours as well because playing games in amber is always really nice and playing games in green as well.
Well, we haven't mentioned that yet. So basically it's a dungeon crawler with a real kind of old school look to it, isn't it? So imagine you're playing it on an old amber monitor, or like you said, a green screen monitor. It's all that aesthetic, isn't it? It's basically amber and black, green and black, or kind of turquoise and black. So it looks like, the kind of game that you would have seen on like, really early PCs. I imagine this would look beautiful on a CRT.
Yeah, that's what I mean. We're seeing YouTube videos and it's probably not really representing what it really is. I can imagine it would look mind-blowing on that, to be honest. I
mean, I've been reading some of the comments. Some people are not taken with the look. I mean, I've never owned a green screen or an amber monitor, but I've always liked the aesthetics of that.
And my friend had an Amstrad, and I used to play on the green screen, and I really liked it. It was a good way of playing. I think we're seeing more games like this where there's deliberate glitching, there's deliberate kind of low palettes, and they're obviously compatible with high-end systems, and it's a design choice. Yeah. And I think some people are going to go mad for this, and some people are going to absolutely hate it. The minimap looks cool as well. It does look like quite a complex interface for a game, and
it's like those old school dungeon crawlers, really, isn't it?
If you're used to that, you're going to be able to play it. But if you're like someone like me who hasn't played lots of them, I'm going to be lost. But the manual is also built into the game, so that's pretty good. You get a few kind of modern features there. Like one of these older titles would have come with a huge manual. You would have had to
yellow pages
sit
on
down
your
and
desk.
study it. I don't think I've got the patience for that nowadays.
Yeah. I mean, the main comments I'm seeing about the visual style, a bit of people are saying it's a bit hard on the eyes to play a full game. I mean, like you said, your mileage may vary on that. I'm looking at the YouTube playthrough on like kind of amber video mode, and I imagine it's something you can probably change because looking at this playthrough, it's all amber, but then there are screenshots of it in green as well.
Yeah,
I actually find it quite relaxing on the eyes
as well.
Yeah, I find it quite relaxing looking at that actually. But obviously, each to their own.
It's a very artistic looking game.
Yeah. But if you're unsure, there is a demo that you can download now for free if you want to give it a try on Steam. So I'll link that up in this week's show notes. Now, it is always cool when we see unreleased games, particularly when they are of this kind of stature. This is a Yoshi's Egg remake that apparently was unreleased for the Nintendo DS. Now, this story is quite interesting. I did like the Yoshi games back in the day. And I never heard of it called Yoshi's Egg. Was that the original kind of Japanese name for Mario and Yoshi?
Yeah, it was called Yoshi's Egg in Japan, and it was called Mario and Yoshi over here in the UK, which was an NES game, which came out quite late in the NES. I think it was like 91, 92. Right. It came out. But interestingly, and I didn't know this has happened, there's been a Game Freak hack recently.
Hadn't you heard about it? It was absolutely
I hadn't heard about it.
So, Game Freak, I remember seeing their logo on Pokemon games and tons of others as well. They got hacked. And the thing I don't like about this is, people are going out and targeting these companies. There's a lot of personal data that was leaked, employees' emails, people's addresses, stuff like that. And I understand that people want to go out there and get that game and have that look, but these aren't put out in the public for a reason. Maybe some of them are incomplete. The company decided not to do it and stuff. And it's cool that they found a game in this. I just kind of don't like the idea of people targeting companies and trawling through their old stuff in a kind of, oh, look what I've got. You know what I mean? It was a huge hack as well, this one. It is just kind of sad. You know what? It
is always a bit of a moral dilemma when we cover these kind of stories, because obviously a load of great stuff came out of the Nintendo Giga League hack a couple of years ago, which kept us in stories for about 2 months.
And we've had developers on the show that have said, there's this game, and I'll talk about it now. And they've kind of given us information on it. And I'm sure there's tons of games that are hidden behind walls or in companies' assets and stuff. But it also means, people don't get a good view of the gaming public from these companies as well. If they're, constantly getting harassed and, hacked and stuff like this. It's a real kind of quandary. I'm like, So is what we're looking at here then? This is something that's basically come from hackers hacking into Game Freak found
servers,
within this leak. Okay. So the source code has been found and footage as well.
Okay. Yeah. So Ravi's spot on with it. Funny enough, a mate at work told me about it today, and I was just like, I didn't know that had happened. And
so many these days,
so many. And as Ravi just said, Game Freak are the developers behind Pokemon, which is relevant to the story. So it turns out, as part of this, data leak, there was a remake planned / made, which was never released, of Yoshi's Egg or Mario and Yoshi in 2007, and it was made for the DS within the Pokemon Black and White's game engine, which would have been, the Pokemon that came out around, I think it was around 2007, 2008. Pokemon Black and White might have been a little bit later. But it was remade then. And it looks pretty cool. It looks very DS. Obviously a straight remake of the Puzzler. It's a Puzzler game, for anybody who doesn't know. A little bit similar to Tetris. Well, kind of similar to Tetris, maybe similar to Dr. Mario. But there's been a bit of a debate about it because of, interestingly, the startup menu says 1995 on it when you load the game up. So some people are actually debating whether it was a Super Nintendo port that never got, released.
Well, apparently the Super Nintendo version of Yoshi's Egg was actually apparently buried in the source code of Pokemon Black and White, interestingly.
Oh, that's weird, isn't it? That's interesting.
Very odd.
That's very, very odd. Oh, okay, the plot thickens. I mean, as Ravi says, it's interesting, but it's also that moral dilemma of people's, personal details.
I also think but it's interesting news for us to cover as well. But if we're covering it, are we encouraging it? If everybody's covering it, I don't think we're that big that hackers are going to go, no, let's give up. And
I'm going to hack Sega just so I get on the retro ad next week.
But you know what I mean. It's interesting, but being within this engine as well, it does very, like the water effects in it do look very Pokemon-ish.
Yeah. It's definitely got, I was going to say a DS look to it, but yeah, you're right. It has definitely got that kind of like Pokemon look to it, like definitely mid-2000s.
It reminds me of, because we're talking about it last week, Hatris.
Yes.
Yeah, it does look kind of
like that, it does look a little bit like that. I can't say if it had come out, it would have changed, gaming forever or anything like that. I wonder why they didn't. It looks pretty finished.
Yeah. I'll be honest, it doesn't look all that impressive for 2007.
It was a DS
I'm not
game,
sure whether. Yeah, I suppose. Even that, though, it looks like it could have been more Game Boy Color kind of game, maybe.
Kind of
maybe.
like a Dr.
but-
Mario's side kind of spin-off little title or something.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we're not going to link the Game Freak leak in the show notes, but it is out there on the internet. Well, there's a little YouTube video, actually, if you want to get a little glimpse of it, which I think is the best way to get a look, isn't it? 23 minutes long, and the guy actually does a little playthrough on there as well. So, again, I mean, it is always interesting to see kind of games that were in development that, for whatever reason, got abandoned. And even though, we are kind of looking through our fingers, some interesting things do come out of these leaks.
Yeah, I think people are going to be trawling through these for the next year or so.
Yeah, well, I'll probably have more on next week's show. So if you want to check out that video, I'll put that in the show notes as well. Now, we're going to be talking about the internet with our guest, Tara Hernandez, the history of Netscape in just a moment. And you guys know that kind of one of my, I was going to say obsessions, let's call it a hobby, sounds a bit better, doesn't it, is getting as many of my retro computers connected to the internet as possible for some bizarre reason. I've got my Commodore 64, has got a Wi-Fi cartridge in there, so I can go on bulletin boards with my C64. Pretty much all my Amigas. Yeah, I mean, pretty much all my Amigas have got some kind of network interface. And, there are legit reasons why you would want to have that. For example, when I've got my Amigas online, I've even got a little Wi-Fi chip inside my CD32. And it's handy just to go online and kind of, if you want to play a game, just download it straight to the machine.
I think, we're in a world where everything's online, light bulbs, food mixers that really don't need to be
I had an update for my
online.
fridge the other week.
Yeah, your fridge. Yeah, I'm just updating the fridge.
Yeah.
Yeah, don't put any ice cream in there. It's interesting, but getting these old ones online, I really think has some benefits, being able to download stuff for a start and getting access, especially these classic Macs as well. And we're talking about the 1986 Macintosh Plus as well.
Which I must admit is it's before my Mac time. I mean, I did use a Mac in the late 80s at my auntie's print shop. Really, it was a PowerPC stuff that I originally got into. But you've actually got like an 80s classic Mac, haven't you?
Yeah, I've got an Apple 512K. I'm going to try and get it online. This is using Blue SCSI. So a guy called Hunter Irving has made a really interesting video about using Blue SCSI to kind of get it online. And I don't know if Blue SCSI works with the 512K because I think there's not hard drive supported on the 512K. It's even earlier than this. Right. But hopefully I'd love to get something working like this because it does look a bit bonkers. What he's done is he's basically found an old Ethernet adapter. So the Raspberry Pi Pico kind of emulates an old Ethernet adapter, and that works with the Blue SCSI device, which is connected to his machine. So it's emulating this old Ethernet adapter, which means he can get online. But in this whole video, he's figuring out quite a few problems because, it's not just as simple as kind of getting online as you would, just nowadays load up a website. Of course, there's a lot of stuff like HTTPS as well. There's security protocols that, it's not going to recognize. This is only going to read HTML very basically. So what he's actually done is he's gone for a root of things. And I know we've mentioned stuff before like frogfind.com, which...
Sean from Action Retro, we've had him on the show, haven't we?
Yeah, Sean from Action Retro. It rips out kind of all of the complexities, all the style sheets, all the stuff that it's not going to read, and it just presents it in a really awesome format. Well, there's another thing called a Mac Proxy Plus. It's really awesome, actually. What it does is it enables extensions for certain domains and serves them out as HTML interfaces. So, he's managed to get like Wikipedia working on there and other sites using this kind of Mac Proxy Plus. And what you can do is you can customize it and edit it. He's even got one of the AI assistants working on there, which is that kind of mix of the modern world and the old classic world. Now,
get ChatGPT going on your old 40-year-old Mac then.
Yeah. So he's also got this really interesting interface, which is called WebSim as well, and it's an AI engine that enables you to basically create websites that do anything. On the Mac, there's an ability to play films, which is pretty crazy. And it's called MacFilm, which, enables you to play films in like black and white modes. And he's added this ability to use the AI to create a website to then find the Mac films and present it as a kind of a fake YouTube and play videos kind of like on a YouTube interface. So he's got a Rickroll running on there, and
which apparently took 17 hours to render, apparently.
Yeah, 17 hours to render, but it still runs. And it's pretty amazing that he can kind of build this whole vintage internet system just using these tools that are available online, a small adapter and a Raspberry Pi.
That is incredible. Because if you watch a video, I mean, it's only a quarter of an hour long. He crams a lot into here. And yeah, he's basically using the old Mac Web 2 browser. And he's on Reddit on there. He's on the Wayback Machine.
Which is
Hackaday.
A lot more than I've seen other people do.
Yeah.
Pushing it that far. And I'm sure this proxy could start to be used for other systems as well. Like,
that's what I'm thinking. I'm thinking maybe I try this on the Amiga.
Yeah, your Amiga or Commodore 64,
Yeah, I'm back on YouTube. I need ideas. Not I'm going to rip him off, but I could try it on the Amiga. So if you want to check out Hunter's incredible video, subscribe to his channel as well. He's got some awesome stuff on there. 11,000 subs he's on at the moment. And this video is doing really well, 45,000 views at the time of recording. So if you want to get a look at classic machines online, which we are fans of, Ravi and I have always found this stuff interesting, being massive nerds, as I believe Joe said at the start of the podcast. Was that description?
Absolutely.
Yep, that was it. So, if you want to check that out, I'll link that. And, of course, all the rest of the stories in this week's show notes. Now, we're going more into the world of classic internet with our guest this week, Tara Hernandez, the rise and fall of Netscape, coming up in just a minute. Before we do that, let's take a second to give a massive thank you to our longest-running supporter of the podcast. Over 6 years, we worked with the incredible guys at Bitmap Books. Sam and the crew there. Huge fans of the work they do. And, we are genuine fans of Bitmap Books, aren't we? We get hyped whenever they bring out a new title.
Oh, yeah. They're just beautiful quality.
Well, this new one that dropped last week, don't know if you guys have seen this, loads of buzz on my social media timelines over the last week. This is a new book that celebrates the history of footy games. It's called A Tale of Two Halves, The History of Football Video Games. Now, this is actually written by a former guest that we've had on the podcast, who's a journalist, historian, documentary maker as well, Richard Moss.
He did The Secret History of Mac Gaming and absolutely love that book. Very detailed.
Now this, you're kind of our resident football fan. So going through the titles they've got in this book, they cover 400 football games, going back to the earliest days, through all the big ones that we remember playing.
I've just been going through the list, like just looking at some of the titles they cover. It's insane. It's like, for the primitive football games, going to, the huge 3D titles that we have and realism. And what I kind of loved and I always found really funny about football games was the way that they kind of developed. Obviously now they're really into the kind of realistic area. What I loved was some of the 2D ones where I think it was FIFA, you could run away from the referee when he tried to give you a red card and he'd have to chase you around the stadium. I remember ISS Pro as well. Some of the commentary on there was hilarious. His head must be full of lead. There was all kinds of stuff like that, and some great memories with them, as well as football management games. I used to sit there watching teletext, seeing the scores update on a Saturday, and kind of have my
in your Forest shirt.
Yeah, in my Forest shirt, and have my kind of team going as well at the same time. 2 screens, 2 CRTs. Yeah, absolutely love it.
Well, this it basically covers all the classic ages of video games from like 1980 right up to 2010 as well. Even games that, I'm not a huge football fan, but I did play quite a lot of Sensible Soccer and Kick-Off back in the day. Even I could understand those, not understanding much about football. Legendary titles in here as well. And actually it spans one of their biggest books, 628 pages. And it's got, there's actually a foreword by legendary football commentator Clive Tidsley in the book as well.
Oh, awesome.
So, yeah. If you've if you're familiar with him, if you watch footy on the telly, and interviews some just legends of the industry. Jim Bagley, who worked on Striker, Kevin Toms, Football Manager, lots more as well. So if you're a fan of football games, this is a real love letter to that genre. So I'll link that up. It's available right now. Check it out on the rest of their retro gaming collection. A Tale of Two Halves, the history of football video games at bitmapbooks.com. All right, well, thank you for checking out the news. This week, we'll have more for you on next Friday's podcast. A reminder, we're going to be doing our Patrons Hangout this weekend. That's where we get all our patrons together, basically on like a massive Zoom call, and we geek out about anything and everything. So very good time to support this podcast on Patreon if you're not already a member. Give you a load of other perks as well, don't we? We chop the ads out the main podcast. We do a bonus podcast for our gold members and above, which there is a new episode out now of the Retro Hour After Hours.
How many episodes on that?
It's 45.
45. That is a huge backlog. So, if you become a patron, man, 45 episodes you can listen to us for hours and hours.
Yeah, an exclusive part of Discord as well. We're chatting away every day in there, aren't we, with our patrons? So we'd love to get you signed up and part of the Retro Hour Patrons community. All the details to join are on the website at theretrohour.com. Right, then next, getting the story of the rise and fall of the legendary Netscape with our guest, Tara Hernandez. You're listening to the Retro Hour podcast, and it is time to welcome on this week's very special guest. And actually, today we're going to be talking to someone who's right at the heart of one of the most exciting and, let's be fair, competitive periods in tech history. And we're going to be exploring the 1990s browser wars as well, with the awesome Tara Hernandez, who had a really pivotal role at Netscape Communications back in the day. And the company, of course, that brought the web to the masses with Netscape Navigator. And you may have seen Tara on documentaries like Code Rush and the awesome Valley of the Boom as well, giving us an insider look at the thrills and spills of the dot-com boom and crash. So let's welcome on our guest this week. How you going, Tara?
I'm quite well, thank you.
Really appreciate you taking some time to do some reminiscing with us today, because obviously such an important and exciting period of computing that we're going to be exploring here. But I think it's always interesting to find out kind of our guests' journeys and where your story began. I mean, do you remember what initially got you into computers? Where did your journey start?
Well, it's really interesting. I was never a really gung-ho computer person. Like when I was in high school, we bought one of the early Macs, right? The very first one with a tiny little monochrome screen, no hard drive. We bought an extra floppy drive so we didn't have to, eject the application floppy in order to save our files for word processing. But I remember that my favorite thing about that computer was it Castle of Wizardry? It was an early side-scroller game, and it had swinging through the castle and dodging the bats and all of that stuff. And I spent way too many hours when I should have been doing my homework playing that game. But that was really kind of what I liked about computers. It was just another way. It was fancier than the Atari 2600 that we had, right? But I had every intention when I went off to university to double major in history and literature. But my parents were very much, if you don't do a math or science, we won't pay. And my roommate had talked me into going down to the natural sciences building to get an email account, because at the time, very few people had them, right? You had to buy a subscription through AOL or CompuServe, or I forget what the other one was. But at UC Santa Cruz, where I went, any student, you didn't have to be part of a particular major, any student can have an email address and use the email systems. And so I had an email address, and of course, who are all the other people who have email addresses? Computer science people. So when I had to pick a science, I'm like, well, I guess I'll do this, because at least I know people. And that's how it all started. And I'll tell you, I was a terrible student. I was absolutely awful. All that mathematical proofing, I don't care.
Was there quite a lot of hype around email then? And,
No.
Did you have to get it described to you by people at the time? Or?
Well, I knew what it was. I just didn't really understand the point of it, which, in hindsight, it's like, well, clearly I'm not one of those early entrepreneur types, right? I had really no interest. And this was all sitting on mainframes in the university. So you had a login to a particular mainframe. So I was, Tara, at UCSCB, which was a piece of physical hardware. that's where all of the riffraff students could have their email accounts. If you're a professor, you had a different mainframe that you could use. But then I discovered some of the kind of cool stuff that you could do. So there was an early, let's generously call it a chat app, but it was one-to-one. It wasn't a group. It was called Talk. And you could very awkwardly talk to somebody if they happened to be on the mainframe at the same time as you. But then the really interesting thing I discovered was the forums, which was like, bulletin board style, right? Not interactive, not live, but people would post messages and announcements. And at Santa Cruz, there was already a culture of what they called the geek houses. So off-campus housing where people in the computer science or computer engineering or adjacent majors would share housing, and then the geek, and usually in those, they would all have those majors in common, and then they would have geek parties. And the most famous of these was called the Armory, because the principal denizen of the Armory went by the Armorer, and he was I don't want to say he was an arsonist. that's a little negative, but he liked to blow things up and build things that
pyromaniac.
There we go. Thank you. That's a better word. He was a pyromaniac, and so the parties at the Armory often involved flame. He was also very famous for having built a tennis ball launcher, and it used denatured alcohol as a fuel and a disassembled lighter as the ignition. And it could launch a tennis ball down the beach an unbelievable distance. So, I felt very much like a kid in a candy store, just kind of wandering around with big, huge eyes, watching and listening to these really smart people and feeling completely out of place, to be perfectly honest.
And I guess this was in the late 80s, and I was wondering how
late 80s, early 90s, yeah.
Yeah, how you started programming as well, and were you programming on the mainframes?
Yeah. So my intro to programming class was my sophomore year of university, and it was in Pascal. And that was actually a lovely language to learn in because it had very clean concepts of data structures. And for someone who had never programmed before, I was not the kid in the basement, who was teaching myself. Like I said, my only interest was playing a couple of video games. So, I got to learn a lot of the basics using Pascal. And then, like many universities at the time, and probably still, that was sort of it on teaching us to program. Everything else was, left as a lesson to the student. And subsequent programming classes were in C, which is not a great language to learn in, and does not have clean data structures, clean anything. And having to keep track of pointers and addresses and all that other stuff was very daunting. So I was never like a particularly profoundly adept coder until I got into the workforce and discovered by then there were new languages coming out that made more sense to me. And I had concrete reasons to use them, right? I'm the sort of person that I don't learn well in abstract. I learn well in concrete ways. I probably would have been better, honestly, at a vocational school.
Because I did hear that you went to Borland Software Corporation, they were known for software development and deployment products, weren't they? How did you get the job there, and what was your role there?
So at UC Santa Cruz, which is on the other side of the Santa Cruz Mountains from Silicon Valley, right? So it's close to Silicon Valley, but there's all these, there's a coastal mountain range in the way. But there were many companies already on the Santa Cruz side, and the two in particular that if you were a student at UC Santa Cruz, you tried to get into one of these two companies. One of them was Borland, but that was the second choice for many. The first choice was a company called Santa Cruz Operations, which came to be known as SCO, which most people, if they've ever heard of it, know it as a patent troll. But when it started, it was an operating systems company. Santa Cruz Operations had an operating system, and everybody wanted to work there because, one, you got to work on an operating system, and two, it was the original company was at a converted Victorian that had a hot tub in the backyard.
Wow.
You got to sit in the hot. It was a very Santa Cruz kind of company. There's a lot of hot tubs in Santa Cruz. So, but I was not a good enough, while I enjoyed my operating systems class, I wasn't particularly good at it, so I did not get a job there. Friends of mine had gotten in at Borland already and said, hey, they're opening up an internship on the languages team. They need build engineers. I'm like, what's a build engineer? They're like, well, you'll find out when you come. And I'm like, okay, fine. And it turns out what a build engineer is. They don't code, or at least we didn't code at that company. Our job was mainly to run, make, to compile the code. We didn't necessarily own the build system part. The developers did that, but we ran it and we produced the binaries, and then we made the floppy disks.
Right.
So I would sit there, and the Borland C++ 4.0 compiler was 5.25 inch floppies and 60 3.5 inch floppies.
Wow.
I bet you're glad when CDs came along, weren't you?
I cried when CDs came out, having optical discs. And before CDs, we experimented with things like jazz drives and zip drives. You remember those things? Big clunky things. And what was really fascinating about it is, you think now I have some of the boxes, right? You get as an employee, you would get a numbered box because you used to buy the software at the store in a big box. And the compiler not only had all those floppies, it came with books, right? There was no World Wide Web yet. And so all the documentation was in physical paper books. So the box weighed like 30 pounds.
They were like a telephone directory, I bet, were they, those books?
Well, there was like 6 of them, yeah. And they were thick, right? So compiler information. And so here's a funny story about Borland too, which is, so I got what would be considered kind of a low end on the glamour job, right? Most students who got jobs at Borland wanted to be in tech support. And you say that and people kind of look at you funny because there's a connotation around tech support, especially these days. It's like, oh, well, that's some poor schmucks in, the middle of nowhere at a call center making no money. But tech support at Borland, they could help you debug your program. And in fact, if you paid extra, they could help you debug your program in a different compiler, not even a Borland compiler. So the tech support folks at Borland were considered elite class. And I was not one of them.
Yeah, a lot more than just turning it off and on as kind of the reputation.
Yes.
Of tech
IT
support,
crowd. Yes, we love that show. My wife just got her new T-shirt with Moss on it.
Oh, awesome. Nice. I love Moss.
Yeah, I was wondering then, when did you first hear about the World Wide Web?
This is kind of a funny story. So Borland was the first a real tech job that I had. And this was a huge secret at the time. But when Windows 95 was about to be released, it was Microsoft's first 32-bit operating system. But the Microsoft compiler at the time was garbage. So there was a secret program where the Microsoft operating system division reached out to us and said, hey, we're going to be releasing the Windows 95 Developer SDK CD, and we need to put your compiler on it. So everybody who was involved in that project had to sign, non-disclosure agreements in blood and promise their firstborns and all those other crazy legal things. And it went out, and people noticed, like, oh, hey, look, the Windows disk has a Borland compiler on it. So the Microsoft compiler team was, as you can imagine, a little bit put out by this. And they reached out and they offered unbelievable salaries and signing bonuses, and they basically poached the entire languages team, well, not the entire, but most of the languages team away. And all of those people went, and Borland sued for unfair business practices and won. But it didn't matter because, even though they won it, they couldn't force everybody who had moved from California up to Washington to work for Microsoft to come back. So Borland, basically, that was the beginning of the end for them. And the reason that, Microsoft Visual Studio and ActiveX and DirectX and all those other really amazing developer technologies came out of Microsoft was because those were all Borland employees originally.
Oh, wow.
And I bring this up. So this was the first Microsoft lawsuit that I experienced. And then a bunch of the Borland people who did not want to move to Washington, they joined this little startup in Mountain View, which is actually in Silicon Valley, a little town called Mountain View, called Netscape. And so a bunch of the Borland folks went to Netscape. I was dragged along. And as you know, a few years later, Netscape also sued Microsoft and won, but it didn't matter. So I have this sort of DNA level hatred of Microsoft now that's just sort of baked in.
I mean, had you used like Mosaic, and were you familiar with the web before you went there?
Not a thing. Not a thing. Yeah. So there's a woman, her name is Joy Lenz. She's amazing. I've worked with her at I think 3 companies. She keeps saying she's going to retire, and then she gets bored and goes off and, joins another startup. But she called me and she said, hey, you want to come work at Netscape? And I'm like, I do. She says, yeah, you really do. You got to get out of Borland and come work at Netscape. I'll get you an interview. I'm like, okay. So I went and I interviewed. It was a very chaotic place. I mean, there's people running around, barefoot. And I mean, it was like a frat house. It was very strange because Borland was a pretty well established company, much more traditional at the time, traditional high tech, the IBM sort of style of the pocket protectors and the button down shirts. But Netscape was a madness, and but I ended up joining. I'm like, because I was young and dumb and didn't have any better ideas of what to do with my life. But she had to explain everything to me. She's like, okay, so you need to start by this date. So this was July of 1995. She had called me, so I'd done the interviews, and I'm about to everybody's been leaving, right? Borland, gone off to Microsoft or wherever. So there's very few of us left. And I'm like, Joy, I got to ship these products. I'm going to feel like a complete heel if I leave before I ship this. I'm the one who does all the floppy disks.
Yeah.
And she says, no, you have to start on this date. I think it was like August or July 31st, something like that. It was like the last week of July. But because I'm an idiot, I basically worked 2 jobs. So I would get up, I would get to Borland at 6 o'clock in the morning. I would work until 3, and then I would drive over the hill to Mountain View, and then I would start working at Netscape, where it turns out I also had a product to ship. They're like, hey, the Windows version 1.2 has got to go out. Can you take care of it? I'm like, okay. So I wrote an installer and built Golden Masters in the first week I was there. And I didn't sleep. It was absolutely nuts. But then I found out the reason she made me do that was because the following week, that was the last week I could have joined and been part of the IPO.
Yeah. I mean, we'll definitely talk about the IPO because that was, the biggest in tech history at the time. But I'm interested, when you first joined Netscape, do you remember the interview and who did that and what that was like?
Yeah, I mean, they had not hired full-time build engineers yet. They were just kind of like the developers were just sort of getting by. And then when Joy hired on and she was hired to run the QA department, and she said, why don't you have any build engineers or release engineers? And they're like, she's like, okay, I know some people. And that's when she called me. So she interviewed me, but she already knew she wanted me to come. She had me talk to a couple of people who did not know how to interview. And then the one interview I remember was by the late Tom Paquin. He was an industry veteran by that point, had been around at a lot of different companies. And I remember he asked me a question. He goes, here at Netscape, we work pretty hard. I'm like, do you think you can work hard? And I'm like, well, yeah, sure. Why not? Like I put in some late nights at Borland when we needed to. He goes, well, what's a late night for you? And I said, most people would work 9 to 5 and I would stay till 7 sometimes, if we needed to. And he started laughing at me. He goes, well, you'll learn. He says, and I don't think he actually really cared that much, but I think he knew to keep an eye on me at that point because there was a 7-month period in the lead up to when we created Mozilla.org where we were working 120-hour weeks. Like we weren't going home.
Wow.
Right. And that was a pretty common thing that happened on the regular at Netscape. It was absolutely, in retrospect, at my age now, looking back, I'm like, that was the most ridiculous, unhealthy thing ever.
Well, what was it like working alongside people like Mark Andreessen and Jim Clark, who obviously, industry legends now, and obviously Jim was already by then, but what was it like working alongside them? Any memories of working with them?
Well, it's funny. By the time I started in, like I said, end of July 95. The company was just a year, maybe a little less. And then the IPO, of course, came quickly in August. So Mark at that point was CTO, I think. The VP was this guy, Rick Schnell, who was a ex-Borland guy. So I knew Rick. And Rick had been around for a long time. I think he had been at Lotus but anyway, he knew how to actually run an engineering organization. And Mark was, off talking high-level technical things and not anywhere I saw him for the most part. But I do remember the first time I actually met him in person. So we were growing like mad. We're in these office buildings on Middlefield Road in Mountain View. There were like 3 people in the IT department. So one more than IT crowd. And the guy in the closet, I forget his name. Anyway, but they were constantly, busy trying to buy new hardware, install operating systems, running network cables around. So I used to stand on my desk and shout like, hey, Darren, the network's out over here. Go flip the switch or whatever. And we're in these cubicles, right? It was the era of the cubicles. So you'd stand on your desk and you could see out over the sea of heads. So, and there was never enough for the number of people we were hiring. We were always trying to expand into new buildings, build out more cubes, run more network. And so me and then the first person that came after me, Brian Ostrom, we were sitting back to back in this narrow cubicle and he was sitting closer to the edge. So if I had to go to the bathroom, I had to get him to stand up, step outside so I could get out, right? So we're really jammed in there. And I had recently stood up to yell at IT to fix the network. and the network still wasn't being fixed, and I really wanted some coffee, and I was starting to swear, and I'm like, God damn it. And then I hear this deep voice. He had a very deep voice, and it's like, I damn thee. And then he says, does it work? And I look around, and there he is standing there with his head over the side of the cue ball, and he's just smirking at me. I'm like, oh my God, really? Is this what we're... And that was the first time I met him. And then, of course, afterwards, it was, he would come in and sit in meetings and say random things periodically, but he wasn't actually, from my perspective, in the trenches, especially with the browser. With Valley of the Boom, they really focus on the browser, but the main money that Netscape was trying to make was actually with the servers.
Right.
You think about like what runs mail. Well, Google does, but back then Google didn't exist. Right. So you had to run your own mail server. So we had a mail server. We had LDAP, which is group account management. We had security server. Like we had all of these services that now are so sort of pervasive and kind of crucial to just our day-to-day living. We don't even think about them, but they had to be invented. So Netscape really invented those early web services. And I think that's where he spent more of his time.
Well, you were build manager, and kind of starting off with Netscape, it expanded to many different platforms. What was that like, supporting 68K Mac, PowerPC, Windows, 16-bit and 32? And was there any pressure from, operating systems to get the best version of Netscape?
Holy crap. Well, I mean, that was... this was before Linux, right? And so operating systems for a lot of the Silicon Valley companies were the way that you sold your hardware, right? Sun made its money selling its Spark workstations and database servers, similarly to Hewlett-Packard and IBM, the big companies. And so they all had their own operating systems. And so, yeah, they were very interested in making sure that there was a web browser on their operating systems. And some of these, it's not just a matter of like, how many bits the operating system has as chipset. The Spark chip versus whatever the hell was running in IBM versus the Intel chips versus the PowerPC chips. And it was one shared back end. And so this is when, as a build release engineer, I started to code because now there was a reason to. Because we had to invent a way of not just compiling all the various operating systems, but understanding the implications of those compiles, right? So if Brendan Eich, who was the guy who unfortunately unleashed JavaScript on the world, when he was working on what was called then libmocha, he would check in something and it would work on his SGI machine because that's what he had, but it would break like half of the other operating systems, and then nobody could compile and everybody was scared to pull. And by the way, this was before Git. Obviously, it was before Git because it was before Linux. And we were using this operating system called CVS, which at the time only worked on Unix-style operating systems. What did we do with Mac and Windows? Glad you asked. We had to run other software on Mac and Windows to export the hard drives of those operating systems in such a way that we could attach a Unix file system to them.
Oh, wow.
I mean, this is practically rock hammers, right, from a technology perspective. And so, we had to invent things like that. And then we had to invent things like, what Martin Fowler came to describe as continuous integration. It's like, oh, well, you check in something and the revision control system says something's been checked in, so now build it and test it, right? Well, nobody had invented that term yet, but we invented a tool that's what it did. So anytime somebody checked in something into the CVS repository, we had a fleet of carefully maintained computers that would grab that change and attempt to compile it. And we had Lloyd Tabb, who was one of the inventors of the early WYSIWYG HTML editor. I think he's also the one who introduced HTML tables as a standard. Now I think about it, it was like kind of cool to be part of all of this. Everything was being invented back then. So we created this tool called Tinderbox, and it created an HTML table that was color-coded. So the axis was changes over time on the Y, and the X-axis was operating systems. And so we could see, oh, there we go. Brendan's breaking all the builds again. And then we could have him roll that change back or fix it or whatever. And if I had had an ounce of entrepreneurship, I would have instantly said, oh, here's a business opportunity. We can do this for every company in Silicon Valley. But I didn't. But Paul Bigger, who later came to work for Mozilla, he did. He took Tinderbox and went, that's a steaming pile of garbage, which it was. And then he went off and invented Circle CI. So there you go. You're welcome.
I guess it's a really hard thing to kind of present one, unified look and unified format on all of these different systems. Like, when they had the ASCII standard and stuff, that changed with different symbols and stuff. And, implementing something like tables and frames must have been, incredibly difficult.
Well, and that's why having the common backend was so important, because so much effort needed to go into the front end, right?
Yeah.
And so we had, all of these operating system experts who knew how to work with those, how to make sure that we rendered things in the actual, user view as consistently as possible.
Was optimization a big focus as well?
So I have a box on my desk, which is Netscape Navigator version 3. And that was the last version that had a C backend. And it fit on a floppy, and it was wicked fast because it was really small, right? Version 4, we had acquired another company, it's CollabNet, something like that. Anyway, they were a bunch of C++ hackers, and their BP came along with, and next thing we know, the backend is now C++. And let me tell you, it no longer fit on a floppy. Thank goodness for CDs, because now it's it's easier to make the golden image masters, but it was much bigger and it got a lot slower, and that was definitely something that people noticed and complained vociferously about.
I'm quite interested to hear a bit more about the culture at Netscape, because you mentioned about the long working hours that were very common as well, and you mentioned a bit it was a bit like a frat house when you first got there as well. I'm interested in kind of the celebrations when things went right, because I heard it was common to be doing like shots in the office at 10 p.m. if things went well. What are your memories of that kind of side of working there? So
my business card, we could give ourselves our own title, and my business card said corporate bootlegger. Because I had the bar, and the reason that the bar came to be was we started this thing called bribery booze, where if you broke the build and we couldn't find you to fix it, and we had to back your change out, we would demand a bottle of booze as an apology, and then we would keep it and we'd hand it out on as necessary. And then, of course, we had to start acquiring shot glasses to distribute the booze. Yeah, it was very terribly unhealthy, like I said, but we were all young and dumb. And because we had all gotten into the habit of working very late, one of the other things that we did on my team was we brought our power tools in and we disassembled and reassembled the cubicles so we would make bullpens instead of individual cubes. And then we would go steal furniture from other parts of the company where like the marketing team would sit. There'd be like these nice leather couches, and we'd surreptitiously go and just steal them and put them in the bullpen so people could just come hang out and sort of decompress. And we had a music system playing Radiohead late at night is my favorite memory. For some reason, it was always Radiohead if it was after 11 p.m. And holding a glass of tequila or whiskey or whatever, and just watching the compiles go by, sort of this glazed look in our eyes, because we were just in a constant state of completely burned out. Right. I have to think that even if nothing else had happened with Microsoft and AOL and all the other things that ended up happening, that it would have just collapsed under its own weight of exhaustion. The employees would have all just collapsed into a, nervous breakdown and never to be seen again.
Did management encourage this style of working then? I mean, I guess it was the only way to get things out on time, I guess, if the work needed it.
I know that that's what people believed, right? But like I said, I've been doing this a long time now. Now I'm a vice president of engineering, and the thing is, tired people make more mistakes. You're not, after hour 60, the quality is going to start really dropping. And, we probably made more problems for ourselves by having the culture that we did, to be perfectly honest.
What are your memories of the IPO then? It must have been a really exciting time.
Oh, dear Lord. Yeah. One of the guys in IT was a much bigger team not much bigger. I guess there were 6 of them by then. He had programmed all of the printers to show the stock price. So when you went to pick up your print, you could see, oh, look, there it is. It's $69, right? There was a bus sign, with a little click thing. Click, 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 click. And it would, every 15 seconds, it would refresh itself to show the stock price. It was just everywhere. There was no websites like E-Trade or anything like that. I mean, none of that existed yet. There was financial services was still not really there. I'm trying to remember. Maybe it was Yahoo. I don't know. Maybe Yahoo had a stock ticker. Maybe the Netscape homepage had a stock ticker. But it was so exciting. And when it closed, I think it was like $72 a share after opening at 26 or something. Everybody started calculating, what they were worth. And every other cube had a millionaire. For the record, I was not one. I started the week before, so my size of the pie was much, much smaller. But I got enough to, down payment for a house, so I can't complain. But it was wild, and I think by 1:00 that afternoon, everybody had given up. The market was open for 2 more hours, and then after 3:00 or 2:00, I forget when the market closes. When the market closed, it was still mid-afternoon, and everybody's running around half drunk, on their way to being full drunk and swimming in the fountain, and racing the remote controlled cars up and down the hallways and all sorts of other nonsense.
That must have really reaffirmed that the work you were doing was heading the company in the right direction, though, and that, because we were talking before we started recording that, there was a bit of an impression at the time that the internet was a bit of a fad and, it wouldn't be something that would last. Did that kind of reaffirm that, this is something to be taken seriously now in kind of not just general culture, but also by business as well?
I'm not sure how much I felt that at that time. I was still like, this is more of a cool toy to me, right? Because again, I don't have an ounce of entrepreneurial spirit. But I think a lot of people were starting, even the young, I'm 24 at this point. I'm practically a babe. But I think a lot of others, who had been there a little bit longer or who had at the company or who had been in the industry a little bit longer was saying, wow, this actually could really blow up. But, so much of what made the World Wide Web successful is how we thought about it, right? The technology, like Netscape helped get it started. But even at Netscape, I don't think any of us truly envisioned what it would ultimately turn into, right? The cultural changes that it enabled and affected to where we are today. Though I do remember Jamie Zawinski, who was one of the Unix front-end developers. We were sitting around at a Chinese restaurant that was, it was like midnight or something, and we had finally left work to go find some food. And he looked around, he goes, what if we're helping invent this new internet and all we're doing is inventing TV again?
Yeah.
Right. And, everybody who was there remembers him saying that because, wow, now that was prescient. Because that's essentially what we've done. I mean, the line between TV and the internet now is completely blurred, right?
Yeah. Everything's
a streaming service. And, everything that is good about TV can be good in the internet, but everything that was worse about TV is 1,000 times worse, 1,000,000 times worse in the internet. My favorite author is Terry Pratchett. And
oh, yes.
My favorite character is Sam Vimes, right? And so I always remember Sam's comment, a lie will get around the world before the truth puts its boots on, right? The internet really makes that happen.
Well, on the 24th of August 1995, Microsoft released Internet Explorer, and that kind of triggered the legendary browser wars. I was wondering what your first memories of Netscape's reaction to Internet Explorer appearing.
Well, we made fun of it, obviously, for 2 reasons. One, it only ran on Microsoft Windows, which, I mean, okay, granted, the majority of the computers, personal computers on the planet were running Windows. So we probably should have recognized that a little bit more carefully than we did. It also was really terrible, right? The first versions of IE were absolutely wretched. We're like, oh, God, nobody's going to want to use this. Nobody did want to use it because it was terrible. And certainly all of our partners who were making Unix servers were completely uninterested. And Apple was trying desperately to become relevant, and they weren't interested in it. So we weren't really worried about it because from our perspective, especially on my team, where we were responsible for building the bits for all of these various operating systems, like, that's just the Windows stuff, right? Not really recognizing that was like 80% of the planet or more. So we didn't worry until they changed the licensing for how Windows was licensed to the OEM hardware vendors. So when Compaq Computer and Hewlett-Packard Desktop and we're being told by Microsoft, we'll license you the Windows operating system for your computers, but we're going to charge you for Internet Explorer whether you put it on the computer or not. Well, now all of a sudden everybody's got Internet Explorer on their computer, and most people don't bother. And it's like, I already have a browser. I guess I'll just use this one, and that was the beginning of the end. Right? There was just no coming back from that because Windows was essentially a monopoly as far as personal computing was concerned. And we didn't really recognize it until we went from having a 93% market share to 50% to, right? It just like all of a sudden, within a couple of months, the whole world changed. And we went from feeling like we're changing the world to what just happened.
Yeah.
Right. And how in the hell did Internet Explorer become top dog? Oh, well, it turns out it was because of illegal licensing practices, and we sued and we lost, but it didn't matter. Right? So it was so frustrating.
I heard that the browser wars got personal as well. I know that Microsoft started playing pranks on your offices. What kind of happened there?
Well, at one point, yeah, they had a thing in Silicon Valley, I forget where, and there was a ginormous IE logo that they left on the front lawn in front of corporate headquarters. But we had not a life size Mozilla, because Mozilla was Godzilla and obviously it wasn't life size, but it was like 6 feet tall. So it was a 1/10 scale, 1/100th scale. I don't know. So we took some pictures with Mozilla sitting on the IE logo and that kind of stuff. And that was fine. That actually felt kind of fun, right? It was like, developer to developer, we were pranking each other, and that felt okay. But it was the other stuff, the legal and the marketing, that all of a sudden it was like, wow, this doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel fair. And when you're young, the concept of fairness is really important. Right? Yeah. In our naivete. Yeah, it got really rough. And the stock price was tanking, and that's when I discovered the concept of margin loans. Thankfully, I never had one, but I knew people who did. The whole concept of you can get a loan against the value of your stock options, but if the stock value drops, the loan is called, and you had people who either had to sell everything they had to pay it off or did not have enough, right? And then were even worse shape. And that was also like one of those life lessons that you never expected to have to learn.
I always remember Internet Explorer wasn't amazingly compatible with things. When Netscape really worked well with that, was there kind of a bit of a technology race between the two companies?
Well, the Netscape and then later Mozilla, thank goodness, really wanted and supported the idea of the W3C and having a standard by which all browsers adhered to. Microsoft doesn't like, well, at least then, I won't make comments now, but, then definitely they did not want to play in the sandbox. They wanted to own the sandbox. So they would try to have their own standards to make sure that websites were built that would only work with Microsoft Windows. And that led, and they would try to get people onto the W3C board to push for things. And that was really ugly too. And it created a lot of angst and acrimony that didn't need to happen. Right. And I hope that Microsoft, as best I can tell these days, they play a little bit more nicely in such ways. But it was really like who gets to call the shots, right? And that idea of collaboration as being a potential value add had not really landed with a lot of companies.
Yeah, I remember coding, and you always had to do like a code version for IE. And it would have specific rules set in there as well. And I guess until they had that complete dominance, that was, always a bit frustrating for people.
Well, do you remember then, you probably had to do this. So for a long time, website developers realized that IE was terrible. And so it would put a browser check into the server that said, is this a Mozilla browser?
Yeah.
But you could claim that you were a Mozilla browser and it would try to render. So every browser in the world, including IE, would declare itself a Mozilla browser so that the websites would load at least somewhat. That really cracked me up. I remember when we first figured out that was going on.
I remember web developers putting those little buttons on their websites as well, like Netscape Now or Best Viewed in IE or this site has for, it's basically trying to direct the user to a certain browser to get the best experience, which obviously for people viewing the World Wide Web wasn't the best experience to be told they had to download different software just to view a website properly.
Not at all. And it got worse when, Macromedia came out and Flash and all that other stuff and the early VR and yeah.
Well, you touched on Mozilla, which obviously was when Netscape went open source. So do you remember when the decision was made to go open source, and what was the feeling? Was there much resistance from management?
Oh, yes. So first of all, it was just the browser because they thought they could still make money on the servers, and I think they did for a long time. I think there was, in the parts of some, a sense that this is a terrible idea and it's not going to work. And in fairness, it really didn't. It not as far as the main goal, which was to save Netscape as a company. But for the durability and success of the World Wide Web as a whole, it was a resounding success because it really, I think, laid the groundwork for not just the Mozilla Foundation and the reality that industry standards actually are something that companies benefit from upholding. But, if it hadn't been for Mozilla and the licensing discussions and all of that, I mean, that also laid the groundwork for the Linux Foundation.
Yeah.
Right. And so when Linux came around, a lot of the sort of logistical battles had already happened and people were much more familiar with what happens next. And instead of, all of the, of Linux sort of suffering the Netscape treatment, it did to a small degree, but not nearly the same. But instead, people realized like it actually doesn't make any sense to have all these different types of hardware and operating systems. Like nobody's going to win. So as an industry, it's better if we just start to standardize. And that's where we got today. It's the Unix wars ended because the browser wars ended, right? So it's kind of weird how all those things came together.
Well, in 1999 as well, Netscape were featured in Code Rush, a great documentary. I was just wondering what it was like when the film crew came in and, what was the atmosphere like?
They actually, it was a really small crew. It was, Dave was the producer and writer, and he had a cameraman and a sound guy, and I think maybe one other person. It was never more than 4 people. And they got really good at being unobtrusive, and we got really good at forgetting they were there. Every once in a while, we would do something silly, like in Code Rush. I don't know if you remember, I'm driving, I have a hat on, and we're in my convertible. It was the one time I had a fancy car. And I'm going to get lunch. And what you can't see is that there's 3 people, the film crew, who are jammed in along with my dogs, because I used to take my dogs to work, and in this Audi convertible heading down the road to Carl's Jr. to get a hamburger. And that was a little bit awkward, but you can't tell in the final filming. It just looks like I'm driving. So, and they came to my house a couple times, and the 5 of us that were featured. And it was kind of cool because they really started to learn the language and over time started asking more interesting questions. And you could really tell that they were also getting into it. And it kind of helped revitalize this idea that what we were, once again, we had an opportunity to do something good for the world, right? We were such idealists. And so we got to get that back a little bit after, the previous couple of years of being pretty disheartening.
It's interesting when you watch it back because, there seems to be a bit of a catchphrase that was doing the rounds at Netscape at the time. You often say that we're doomed.
We're
People
doomed.
keep saying that, but you're saying it while you're laughing. So it was almost like, it was interesting watching that kind of team morale, even though you knew in some ways you were fighting an almost impossible battle, but still you felt like you had to do it. What was the morale like at that time?
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely what it felt like. It's like, we're doomed, but if we're definitely doomed if we don't do anything, and here's a chance to maybe try something, right? And and I think they may have touched on this in Code Rush too, but when the AOL acquisition was announced, the first thing that went around was a reminder that, by the way, AOL can't take it back. They cannot un-open source the open source, right? So no matter what happens now, we did it. We got it out there. The MPL now is a thing. We have thousands of people who have downloaded the source already. Like our baby is free. And so there was a comfort in that because, it lasted another couple of years. Basically, they just bought Netscape for the website, right? The netscape.com. Because that's how AOL thought about things. And it's, I think it's still there, actually. If you go to netscape.com or netscape.net, one of the two, there's still something there. I have no idea what it is. But.
When you're watching Code Rush, it's interesting because it feels like a lot of the team were kind of putting on a brave face when the AOL acquisition was announced, because obviously you're still working, for Netscape at the time. I mean, what was the real feeling amongst the software team?
I mean, financially, it was very lucrative, right? Those people who still had stock options, the stock did have a brief spike, right? And so they were able to, capitalize on that. I actually didn't. I burned out and I went off to join a startup with some ex-Netscapers and Joy Lenz, my old boss from Borland. She ended up at that company as well as a company called Blue Martini, also long gone. But that's tech for you. We move around a lot. But yeah, it was briefly lucrative, but then it was really all about Mozilla.org, right? And Firefox, and the servers had all gone to Sun, if I remember correctly. And that was really the end. But we were, we realized that we now need to look forward. Like, what happens next, right? And what happened next was the .com bubble where everybody was like, oh, look, now we have the internet. Let's go .com everything. And of course, we know how well that lasted. But here we are, right? It's been 30 years now. And the internet is, in its current incarnation, is foundational to the planet, right? There's people in random savanna deserts in Africa and in the middle of the Amazon in South America who, if they get cell service, they have the internet. And some of them are programming on their phones, little web apps and things like that. And it just cracks me up. It's just part of our DNA now as a species.
5.3 billion users of the internet worldwide today, which is insane.
There you go. Yeah, isn't that nuts?
I was wondering, were you doing any gaming in the kind of rare downtime that you had? I know originally there was a kind of pitch for an online gaming network for the N64, which was a kind of way that they would have gone or they would have done Netscape. So I assume there was like a big connection with gaming within the company.
Well, certainly, like within Netscape employees, 5 o'clock, everybody took a break. And if you were on Windows, you were playing Quake. If you were on Mac, you were playing Marathon, which was a really slick game. And then if you were on SGI, somebody had found or maybe themselves ported a copy of Doom, which was a Quake precursor. So everybody took their paws to go blow each other up. Some of us sometimes would play. What was that game called? Oh gosh, I don't remember. But just thinking about it makes me queasy. It was you flew a spaceship inside of a mine. It was
G, please. Was that it?
No, God. Anyway, yeah. So there was this video game culture, and actually one of the employees at Netscape was this guy Jack Palovich, who invented the game Gauntlet back in the day, and then he had offered it to Atari in the hopes they'd give him a job. And then there's actually a pretty famous lawsuit back then where Atari stole it. It wasn't called Gauntlet when he had it. I forget what it was called, but they stole his game, called it Gauntlet, and he sued them and won. And he actually got something out of it, which is he got a small financial piece of the game sales, but he also got a 4-person Gauntlet console that we had in the Netscape client engineering area. So every once in a while you'd be working and you'd hear, "Blue Elf needs food badly." And so that would be another thing that we would do. But like I said, in high-tech industry, we move around a lot. So a bunch of people from Netscape ended up founding a company called OnLive, which you were talking about N64 game streaming. So this tried to be a streaming service. This is in the, I guess, early 2000s, something like that.
Yeah, I remember OnLive, yeah.
Yeah, but the problem was that the bandwidth just wasn't there yet, right? And so they could not figure out how to overcome the latency challenges in order for people to feel like they were having a good game experience, especially if you're doing a first-person shooter. That's very twitchy, right? And so if you've got network lag, it's not a good experience. So it ended up canceling. Google actually in the late 2018-19 released Stadia, right, which was their version. That was 20 years later, and you'd think by then that the latency issues would be resolved, but they still weren't, right? So
yeah, I think GeForce Now has just kind of got it, but of course you're having to pay a premium price for not getting any latency on that. Yeah.
Well, and what's funny is Microsoft Azure as a cloud service. The first big thing they did with it was they used it to back, oh God, what was the game? It was a first-person shooter, and everybody, the way they made it work is that everybody had their own server behind the scenes in the Azure cloud, and then within the Azure cloud, they would talk to each other. Sorry?
Was it Halo, the game?
It was Halo, and there was another one too, but yeah. And that's the thing that really launched Microsoft's cloud service, was actually in support of their gaming division, which was, kind of clever.
I was wondering, that flying game as well, was that Descent you were talking about?
Descent, yes.
That was it. I don't know why I said G, please. Yeah, Descent. God, I remember that.
Yeah. And we actually played that at Borland, and we'd go there was a lab that had a bunch of different computers in it so we could use it for testing, right? The compiler on different hardware. And so we would go in and had Descent installed on all the QA machines, and we would play. But, by the time I was 26, 27, I couldn't play it anymore. It just made me throw up.
Yeah, your body doesn't react as well as you get older sometimes, does it? Too?
No, it really doesn't. I can't do VR rigs either.
Yeah, I'm the same. So obviously after AOL acquired Netscape and Mozilla was started, why did you leave Netscape then? How did your time end there?
So, a bunch of folks who had been in Netscape server and a couple of people in client, they went off to this new early e-commerce startup called Blue Martini. It was one of the first companies to do online retail. So Levi's, Nordstrom's, Kohl's, these are all probably American companies. Canadian Tire, that was, I think, our first international company. They, it's like, let's do online sales. And so it was a bunch of Java code. You'd appreciate that. And so we were selling the client. It was a client server solution. And they called me and said, hey, we hear you're pretty miserable. We're offering you a chance to be early startup, founding engineer at the startup. I'm like, sure, why not? I was number 15, right? So I had to build the whole thing from scratch and ended up getting most of my senior engineers from Netscape to come over, managed to not get sued for doing that. And we had some fun at Blue Martini. I missed out, like I said, on that little stock payout that happened right at the end when the AOL acquisition happened, but I kept my sanity, so I guess it's a good trade-off.
Well, in more recent years, you've also appeared in the awesome Valley of the Boom series, which if people haven't seen that, it's a really interesting show. I loved it. It was it's part dramatization, part like real life interviews, isn't it? And kind of dramatizes what happened back at Netscape and the browser wars and the .com boom. I mean, what was it like being involved in that, and what was it like kind of reflecting on that time again?
Well, it's so funny because when National Geographic reached out, they were saying, well, we're doing a documentary and we saw Code Rush and would you be willing to do it again? And I'm like, sure, why not? So they showed up at my house and now there's like 30 people. Like it's a huge crowd. They haul furniture out. They set up lighting inside and outside. Like it was a big deal. My family was out and they came home like, what is going on? This was completely unlike, Dave's tiny little crew from Code Rush. And so they interview me and we hang out for a couple of hours. It was really fun. Like I'm half Irish, right? The Bardic tradition. I love telling out stories of the old days. And so they said, this is great. Thank you so much. We'll get back to you. And then I didn't hear from them for, 6-8 months, maybe. It was a while. And in the meantime, unbeknownst to me, all that docudrama, they called it, the dramatizations was happening. They had hired someone to play me. I had no idea. But they called me out of the blue and said, hey, we're going down to the Television Critics Association thing. And I had no idea what that was. And apparently in the US, there's a thing that happens in Beverly Hills where they, all the critics come and they want to see the new upcoming TV shows and they get to watch trailers and ask questions of the showrunners and whatnot. And they said, hey, we'd love for you to come. And I was like, sure, why not? And by that point, I think I was working at Google. And I flew down and I got to stay at the Beverly Hills, whatever that fancy hotel is. And it was kind of trippy. And someone said about, yeah, Camille really had a fun time playing you. And I'm like, Camille who? And that's when I found out. And I had no idea. And it wasn't until they actually released it that I saw all the episodes where there was an actress playing me. And I'm like,
that must have been surreal, was it?
It was very surreal. And she's really sweet. Her name's Camille Hollett French. She's Canadian. She cut her, gave herself a terrible haircut and wore the big oversized glasses. And I'm like, I'm so sorry. And you're far better looking than I ever was in my whole life. So thank you for that. You made me look good.
Yeah, it was a really interesting show, though. I thought they captured a lot of it. I mean, obviously the dramatizations there as well, but I think having, the real people, having you involved in it and, other people from the time, I think really gave it some credence as well. So it didn't all feel like it was just kind of fictional like a lot of those shows do.
Yeah, it was fun going kind of the back and forth. And sadly, with the way these documentaries work, they don't interview everybody all at once. Like we don't come into a studio and do the interviews, right? I would have loved to have seen, for example, Roseanne Sino. She's always been a hero of mine. But we just exchanged messages on LinkedIn afterwards. I'm like, hey, I heard you did I heard you did Valley of the Boom. She's like, oh yeah, it was great. We only see each other on the internet these days.
I was wondering what the most valuable lessons you've learned from, your time at Netscape and how they've kind of affected your career now.
I think I really went back to my history literature roots, not so far as the history literature aspect of it, but the humanities aspect of it. Like high-tech industry, you think about it and you think about tech, right? It's the technology. And the technology is important, don't get me wrong, and it's powerful. At Google, they talk about this a lot. And, you recall the Arab Spring when a lot of these really dictatorial governments across Northern Africa and the Middle East, all the protests rose up and some of them were overthrown. And the government
they were turning off the internet as well.
They were turning off the internet and people were spray painting the actual internet address 8.8.8.8, which was Google DNS servers. So people could connect to that directly and get back on the internet, right? And how amazing is that, right? How profound of that type of connectivity. But why it was important ultimately was because of the humans that were involved. right? And so if there's a lesson that I've learned is that when we forget about the humans, things go very bad very quickly. But if we remember the humans, it is any technology becomes a remarkable tool.
And also you were a member for the board of Women Who Code, which was to inspire women to excel in technology careers. And I mean, I know you mentioned before we started recording that there have been some setbacks there recently. I mean, do you think in general there's been progress made since your Netscape days, or is there still a lot of room for improvement there? What's kind of the latest with that?
Well, it's interesting. When I was a student at UC Santa Cruz, it was mostly men, but there was a good number of women. And in the first couple of jobs that I was at, Borland and Netscape, in particular, there were a lot of women there too. Part of that was there were just fewer people, and there wasn't as much competition for the programs, and women tended to do things like documentation, quality assurance, marketing, certainly HR, obviously. And there was a lot more roles that tended to support a higher women population. But over time, it was probably between 30 and 40%, I would guess, of gender balance. By the early to mid 2000s, it was starting to change dramatically. And I think we hit a low point at least in the US, where the high-tech industry population of women was hovering somewhere in the high teens, right? And you could really tell. And it really changed the culture of companies. There was this thing that was started, a term that started going around called brogramming. Some companies even, proudly advertised it, come bro down on some code. Oh, and it got really icky. Yeah. And so out of that, a lot of people, mostly women, but not all women, started to recognize that this is not good. It's not good for the industry and long-term viability. Half the population is women. If you think very practically, this is inhibiting our ability to grow our workforce. It's our ability to gain customers if we have this toxic masculinity, for lack of a better term. And so a lot of organizations spun up around that. The Anita Borg Institute, the Grace Hopper Foundation, and Women Who Code came out in, I think, 2014, and was doing really well for a while. And we got as many as 400,000 women worldwide who were part of this, mostly mutual support, ongoing learning, interview practicing, code practicing, that kind of thing. And we had company sponsors that would contribute so that we could do things like the conferences and scholarships and whatnot. But Women Who Code shut down this year. So did Girls in Tech. So did there was layoffs at Anita Borg Institute. There's actively organizations who are challenging the legality of diversity-oriented nonprofit organizations, as if somehow to recognize that there are women, people of color who have underrepresented status within an organization, somehow fixing that becomes sexist and racist. Sexist against men, racist against white people, whatever. There's some pretty misguided people, to put it gently, out in the world. And companies are very sensitive to how they appear. And so when you have people threatening boycotts and what have you, they're like, oh, well, I guess it's not really that important. And it's really sad. And the amount of money that it took to keep Women Who Code going was a rounding error for most of these companies. It was not a lot of money, a couple million a year total, right? That's practically nothing, considering that they'll spend more than that to go to conferences for the sales kickoffs. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens. But again, high-tech industry is itself, for any industry really, is just a microcosm of the human experience, right? There's been gender challenges, there's been racial challenges since the dawn of time, and what we're seeing that is just played out in new and interesting ways, and smart people will help figure out how to overcome it, and other people who are fearful of whatever it is that they're afraid of will continue to fight against it, and that's just going to be how it goes, I suspect.
And I think having people with experience like you have, champion the cause as well, that can only be a good thing, though.
Yeah, it's that's the thing. To me, it's better for everybody. It's not about me trying to support women against men, right? There's plenty of men I support too. There's plenty of men who have supported me.
Yeah.
Right. It's how do we work together and interact with each other in a way that is mutually supportive? Like, is that so wrong? But if you look at the political climate across the world, you look at industry across the world, it's like, well, obviously many people feel that it's wrong. Collaboration versus competitiveness, people will lean competitive every time.
Well, it's been incredible hearing some of your stories and, what an influential and varied career you've had as well. And thank you so much for coming on and reminiscing with us over the last hour or so. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure on my side as well. Hope you have a lovely evening. And now I get to go start my work day.